We look at why some people begin to outgrow social media. One of the most significant psychological shifts taking place is the movement from external validation to internal approval. In the early stages of engagement, social platforms are often experienced as spaces of connection and expression. But over time, they subtly reshape how individuals measure their worth. Feedback becomes quantified. Likes, comments, shares, and identity starts to orient itself around visibility rather than authenticity. For a while, this system works. It provides immediate reinforcement, a sense of recognition, even belonging. But as self-awareness develops, many individuals begin to notice something unsettling. Their sense of value is fluctuating based on responses they cannot control. A post performs well, and confidence rises. It is ignored, and doubt creeps in. This creates a fragile psychological loop where self-esteem becomes reactive, dependent on an external audience that is both unpredictable and often indifferent. Outgrowing social media begins at the moment this pattern becomes visible. It is not an abrupt rejection, but a gradual realization that external validation, while appealing, is inherently unstable. Psychologically, this is a turning point. The individual starts to reclaim the role of evaluator, shifting from how am I being perceived to what do I actually think, value, and believe. This shift may seem subtle, but its implications are profound. As this internal orientation strengthens, behavior begins to change. The need to share every experience diminishes, not because life becomes less meaningful, but because its meaning is no longer dependent on being witnessed. There is a growing comfort in experiencing something fully without translating it into content. Moments are no longer interrupted by the impulse to capture, edit, and present them. Instead, they are absorbed, reflected upon, and integrated more deeply. This transition also sharpens discernment. Individuals become more aware of how platforms are designed to capture attention and influence behavior. They begin to notice how easily comparison is triggered, how curated images distort reality, and how constant exposure can shape desires that do not genuinely belong to them. But with that awareness comes a quiet resistance. Not necessarily a complete withdrawal, but a refusal to engage on terms that compromise their sense of self. Philosophically, this is a movement toward autonomy. It reflects a decision to ground identity in something more stable than public reaction. When validation comes from within, it is not subject to trends, algorithms, or the approval of others. It becomes consistent, deliberate, and aligned with personal values rather than collective pressure. This does not eliminate the human need for connection, but it changes its nature. Relationships become less about performance and more about presence. What emerges from this process is not disconnection, but clarity, a clearer sense of who one is without constant external input, a clearer understanding of what feels meaningful versus what is simply engaging, and perhaps most importantly, a clearer boundary between expression and approval. So when someone begins to step back from social media, it is rarely just about reducing screen time. It is often a deeper psychological recalibration, a decision to no longer outsource self-worth to an audience. And the insight that follows is simple but powerful. The moment you stop seeking constant validation is the moment your identity becomes your own. If we take this a step further, the shift away from social media is not only about validation, it is also about how the mind begins to value its own clarity. At a certain point, individuals start to notice the cognitive cost of constant stimulation. Social media is designed to be fast, fragmented, and endlessly engaging. It rewards quick reactions, short attention spans, and continuous scrolling. For a time, this feels normal. But as awareness deepens, that constant input begins to feel less like engagement and more like noise. Psychologically, the brain is highly responsive to novelty. Each new post, notification, or update provides a small burst of stimulation, keeping attention in a state of perpetual movement. The problem is not the stimulation itself, but the absence of stillness. When the mind is always reacting, it has very little opportunity to process, reflect, or think deeply. Over time, this creates a kind of mental fatigue that is difficult to identify at first. It shows up as restlessness, reduced focus, or a vague sense that attention is being pulled in too many directions at once. For individuals who begin to outgrow social media, this pattern becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. They start to recognize that their ability to concentrate, to read deeply, or even to sit with a single thought is being disrupted. What once felt entertaining begins to feel intrusive. There is a growing awareness that attention is not just a passive resource, it is something being actively shaped and, in many cases, depleted. This is where the shift toward depth begins. Instead of seeking constant input, individuals start to value uninterrupted thinking. They become more intentional about what they consume and how they spend their mental energy. Activities that require sustained focus, reading, writing, problem solving, or even extended conversation begin to feel more rewarding than rapid consumption. The pace slows down, but the quality of engagement increases. There is also a philosophical dimension to this change. When the mind is no longer flooded with external stimuli, it becomes possible to encounter one's own thoughts more directly. This can be uncomfortable at first. Without distraction, unresolved questions, uncertainties, and deeper reflections surface more clearly. But this is also where insight develops. Clarity is not something that emerges from constant activity. It is the result of giving the mind space to organize, question, and understand. As this process continues, priorities begin to shift. Experiences are chosen not for how quickly they entertain, but for how deeply they resonate. Conversations are valued for their substance rather than their speed. Even silence becomes meaningful, not as an absence, but as a condition that allows thought to take shape. What was once perceived as missing out is redefined as filtering out a conscious decision to engage less, but with greater intention. Importantly, this is not about rejecting technology altogether. It is about redefining the relationship with it. Social media in itself is not the issue, it is the unconscious, habitual use of it that fragments attention and dilutes focus. When individuals outgrow that pattern, they are not losing connection, they are reclaiming control over their cognitive environment. What emerges is a mind that is more deliberate, more focused, and more capable of depth. And in a world that constantly competes for attention, that capacity becomes a significant advantage not just intellectually, but emotionally and psychologically as well. So the real transformation is not in what people stop doing, but in what they begin to value. Because the moment you protect your attention, you begin to protect your ability to think clearly, and that may be one of the most important decisions you can make.